somewhat of the same group on April 2nd, which is a long time ago. And so this is a follow-up meeting to the original meeting that we had. In the original meeting that we had, we discussed the results of our natural resource inventory, which is this big, thick book. And we actually gave you a copy of that, a couple of CDs with the PowerPoint presentation that we gave in April. But basically, the book looks at the 11-town service area of the Upper Saco Valley Land Trust. So that starts at Hart's location and runs all the way down into Denmark and Maine on the other side of the state line. And we looked at a whole bunch of different variables that we could measure, like where the aquifers are, where the rare plants are. There were 13 variables all together. And we ranked our whole service area based on where those variables were showing up or not showing up. And then we tried to prioritize the focus areas based on what came out of the model. So it was a computer model, and the computer model gave us focus areas. The point of the natural resource inventory was to count measurable things on the surface of the earth, things that you can attach a number to. But we did not take into consideration cultural, scenic, or historic resources. The resources that we care a lot about as a land trust and that the town cares a lot about, but you can't really measure them. You can't stick a number to it. So again, those are scenic, cultural, and historic resources. So phase 2 of this process of prioritizing where the Upper Saco Valley Land Trust is working is all about interacting with the towns and making sure that we're taking those into consideration. So at the last meeting that we had, we actually brainstormed a number of properties and areas in Jackson, and we'll go through that list later, and discuss where they actually are and what attributes they might have. But to begin with, we were thinking that Forrest was going to present what's called a build-out analysis. And we find that build-out analyses can be very useful for towns to help determine where we're likely to see development in the future and where we should be focusing our conservation efforts first. So the whole big message of today and the whole big message of the NRI is, where do we focus our limited resources? Everything is worth preserving, but where do we focus our limited resources? This book tells us where to focus our resources based on countable stuff. You guys will help us focus our resources based on historic, scenic, and cultural resources. And I think Forrest's presentation will provide yet another avenue of how to focus resources based on a build-out analysis that can predict, it's a computer model, but it can help predict where development pressures will happen first. So we were going to begin the meeting today with Forrest's build-out for a town also in New Hampshire, south of us, actually a watershed area. And see how that relates to Jackson. And then we were phase 2, part 2 of the meeting would be much more informal, and we'd like to invite everybody up to just sit around the table here, and we can go over some maps and discuss some specific properties in question. So, does anybody have any questions right off the bat? Okay,
great.
I'm going to sit in the audience.
Sounds good. Thank you, William. So this is a tool that my company has worked with quite a few communities with in New Hampshire and Maine specifically. All the communities we've worked with would be ones where I say that I would consider very high-end natural resource-based communities, like Jackson is. I don't know what a low end. Maybe I shouldn't say that because I don't know what a low end. I grew up in kind of a low end natural resource community. Actually, where I live in Gorham, Maine now is actually, we have the Presumpscot River that runs through it, but there's just a lot of different pressures, I should say, there. So what I'm going to do is just go through a build out for another town. It's Wolfboro, New Hampshire, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. So it's not that far away. And this is an example of something we're hoping to see in this region.
As you go through this, or maybe at the end, if you could spend some time, think about spending time, discussing what a build-out analysis could look like for Jackson.
Okay.
We are approaching redoing our master plan, and one of the questions that I think we all have is, how much it would cost and what's the wisdom of doing a build gems.
Okay.
There was something done a number of years ago about the the Ellis watershed.
Mm-hmm.
It was very high level.
Okay.
But I mean, at some point, I don't want to derail this, but if you could just...
That's not derailing. I mean, that's the exact questions I hope to ask. I mean, ask anything and actually interrupt me. Feel free to interrupt me. I'm going to go kind of slowly through this. There's not that many slides,
I just
so...
wanted to warn you where I'm going at the end. So.
Yep, absolutely. Good.
He wants you to go there.
Yeah, for sure. Well, hopefully you'll find this interesting. So, for this project, just to give you some background, we were actually hired to put together a watershed management plan for Lake Wentworth in Wolfboro, which is just east of Lake Winnipesaukee. And so this was just one component of that project, but because Lake Wentworth is considered by the state of New Hampshire as a high quality water, it's actually classified that way, a lot of what we wanted to look at was not just what's there presently, like this boathouse, but what could happen in the future. And so land protection, ordinance work, these are the sorts of things that we looked at as part of the plan. So just wanted to show this to you. Before I do that, I'll just mention Jackson, and you're probably familiar with these numbers. Population increase over the years. Between 1990 and 2000, an increase of 23%. That was on the higher end for this area. And then, maybe not surprising also, there was actually a decrease in population in the last 10 years. So I'm illustrating a couple things. One, just factually what's there, and another is that growth rates do fluctuate. And growth rates are a major, population growth rates, there's a number of engines or inputs that drive this model, and that's certainly an important one. And Wolfboro, which I'm going to be talking about, is not that different. So, they had a very low growth rate in the last decade and a fairly similar growth rate. So I think there's some comparisons that could be made along those lines. One thing to think about, I just had a discussion with my staff member that actually does a lot of the work, the inputs, pushes the buttons of everything that goes into the model. And it came up in Bartlett of, well, what about the seasonal dwellings? And this is population growth, so this doesn't necessarily count seasonal. So that in a community like Jackson, and that's probably a very important thing to consider. And we haven't done it for the other communities we've worked with, but certainly I imagine building permits would be a way to go.
And we have that study done by the Housing Coalition.
Okay.
And that book is available. I don't know if it goes up to 2010 or what, but
okay.
It's pretty close numbers.
Okay.
But we've got just about as many seasonal residences as we do year-round residences.
Yeah, I thought about that when I put the slide together. I said, doesn't really tell the story. It tells half the story, for sure. So, okay, so what is the build-out analysis? We use a program called Community Viz, V-I-Z. It's a software program that's fairly pricey to buy, and we spent a lot of time learning the ins and outs of it. There are many different applications of it. You do the build out, and then sort of step two is, well, what is the impact of that build out on X, Y, or Z? What's the impact on the aquifer? What's the impact on one of the lakes in the community? Drinking water supplies. There's so many different ways you can go with it. So a lot of what we do is the first step. So the first thing we figure out is how much land is currently available for development, and I'll show you what that means in a second. Where and when will development occur? Now the model's not exact on that. There's some randomness like there is in any model, but it does give you a visual picture of what it could look like. And then that second step, which is actually, I guess, a third step, what are the impacts from future development? And I'll show you what we did in this case, which I thought was really interesting, and we had a lot of positive feedback from Wolfboro on what we found out. So I mentioned the engines that drive the model. So the growth rates I already mentioned are one, and again, for the communities in this example, we're talking about 2% annually. it seems like a simple number, but there was a lot of work that went into getting that number because the town planner for Wolfboro said that the census numbers were off. So that's a tough starting point when you're working with growth rates. So we worked through that and came up with these numbers. The existing buildings, so this is often one of the bigger labor-intensive pieces. You know, in a community like Conway, where you're in the thousands, it's a lot more labor-intensive than a community like Jackson. So that means digitizing, putting in digital form all the buildings. And I should mention that this is a GIS-based software program, Geographic Information System. So it's a mapping and model built into one. So again, counting all the existing buildings and then digitizing them, making them a point. And the good thing is once it's done once, you have that forever, essentially. And in Wolfboro, we had to hand digitize a lot of the buildings, which meant going through the area orthoquads one by one and zooming in and making sure we counted every single building. And we had some quality assurance we had to do related to that. Zoning. So every community has different zoning, and the different zones actually are often grow at different rates. So that's something else that's broken out and is a very important piece. I don't imagine your zoning is digitized here in Jackson. So that's something we usually do as part of a build-out analysis because so few communities have done that. Development constraints is a big one, and obviously would factor in very high in Jackson. So, you know, these are where you can't build. Well, obviously, conservation land, you know, assuming there's no additional building allowed. Steep slopes, especially if there's an ordinance in place. I don't know enough about Jackson to know if you have one in place.
Why can't you build on steep slopes?
Why can't you? You mean in
ordinance?
In general? In general, a lot of the
More expensive. I appreciate that.
Yeah, it is more expensive. Usually, we look at a lot of stuff from the stormwater management perspective. Thinking, you know, about Hurricane Irene and the impacts that were felt up here. Is that once you get to a steep area, you know, the amount of stormwater containment that would have to happen on that site is really difficult to adjust, and then, you know, keeping that runoff from leaving the site and going down to the nearest stream untreated, that's usually, you know, one of the big factors.
It also can affect septic approvals.
Right.
What's that?
It can also
And septic, yeah, good point. Yeah.
So, but, you know, in terms of the actual barrier to development, other than septic, what do you
Septic
have?
and drainage.
Septic and drainage would be the two pieces.
Yeah.
Yep, and cost.
Well, you know,
Yeah, but that can be overcome.
Yeah.
Yep.
And when you say digitized zoning, is that so you can integrate with other software, so you can take a plot of land and basically plug in your zoning so you know what's buildable there and what isn't?
Correct. Yeah, and
how difficult a process is that to do?
how difficult a process depends on how complex and less obnoxious.
Our zoning is really pretty simple.
Okay, so yeah, Wolfboro was unbelievably complex, and I'll show you why on another slide.
We basically have two zoning elements, so soil space
Okay.
and density measure, so.
Okay.
That in frontage is fairly straightforward.
Right, so that really means just digitizing, you know, where those boundaries and borders are within that and making sure they're accurate. Wetlands, existing buildings, again, hydric soils, highly erodible soils, and then you can't build within the right-of-ways, and then shoreland zoning. So these are, again, these might vary somewhat from community to community. And then what we call assumptions, and these might be, I like to look at these as unique features. So again, different towns have different zonings. Maybe there's an aquifer protection overlay or something else that has different pieces that need to be incorporated into the model. So
We have a river conservation district, so that would be...
okay, so that would be one. That would be one in Jackson. All right. Any questions on kind of the drivers of the engine? Okay, so in this example, once we did that analysis, what we found out is that in this, so this is a watershed. William mentioned that. I should point this out. So here's the town line for Wolfboro. This is Brookfield, Ossipee, Tuftonboro. So this is a watershed or a drainage area. So this is all the land that drains into Lake Wentworth and therefore can impact Lake Wentworth. And all these different colors in this map are the different sub-watersheds or sub-drainages. Another way to look at that, they're all different streams that drain into the lake. So we, the steering committee that we worked with wanted to look at all of these sub-drainages separately, and we actually had a very sophisticated model where we were actually calculating the amount of phosphorus that was going to be running off each of these sub-watersheds, and that was a big piece of our project. So within these towns, 44% of the total watershed area we found out was potentially buildable, and that's interesting in and of itself when you just get to this point. I mentioned, we talked about zones, so look how many different, all these different colors represent the different zones in Wolfboro. It looks like 9 different zones, so that was a little more complicated. They also wanted to look at the build out per each of these zones. And that's just another way of looking at how many buildings were in each zone. This is just another way we wanted to display the data instead of on a map on a bar chart. So
if I could, so the software basically, I presume, if you have a large tract of land that's undeveloped, that's otherwise buildable, the software will assume that it is subdivided in the most efficient way to generate building lots for a developer for building.
correct. Correct, and our job as the scientists and planners involved in this is to make sure how the engine runs is consistent with whatever specific ordinances you have in the town. So again, Wolfboro, 1,870, and the town of Brookfield, 394 existing buildings. So we're starting with 2264. So again, I'll show you visually instead of the numbers. This is basically just the amount of buildings, how they would increase. This is the build-out date on this line, 2017, 2022. How many years into the future? So this is for Brookfield, and this is for Wolfboro. And one of the things you can do in the model is you've probably seen this before, do a time series, so you can do every 5 or 10 years and show the build-out visually based on that. And so the end result was in the town of Wolfboro, 2043. So we're talking only about 30 years into the future. The model predicts that town is going to be fully built out, no place left to build. And then our job was, well, what is that impact potentially going to be on the lake? So what did it look like? So this is the existing buildings in 2012. So this is, I mentioned, we had to do the work of hand digitizing every single building, and you can see this is the town center in this area, and obviously a lot of development around the lake, and also on the roads in between. And then I'm just going to take you through some time. So the management plan that we worked on, we really tried to bite off about a 20-year chunk because so many things change, beyond 20 years. It's hard to really take a realistic look at things. So there's 20 years from now. The black buildings are all the new buildings. So we've already added in 20 years 1,000 buildings. And then 2043, so 31 years from now, is the predicted full build-out. So this is not Brookfield, but this is the town of Wolfboro. So basically, once this is built out, this is, an example of what it would look like.
Of course, is that maximum possible, or is that the predicted when you put the assumptions into the equation too?
Say again?
Is that what's the maximum possible, or is that what's...
That's with the assumptions. That's with everything.
Okay, so it's not necessarily that that's the most possible, but that's what you...
Right. A lot could change that could impact this. Whether it's the zoning, whether it's lot sizes, there's a lot of different things. So it's based on the snapshot of what is now. And I should mention that one thing that came up when we presented this publicly in Wolfboro at the end of the summer was they decided that every 5 years, they're going to rerun the model, essentially, knowing that growth rates could change. A lot could change. So
So is this
ordinances will change. Actually, they're already in the process of changing
Is
some
this
ordinances.
based on the growth rate of the last 10 years or the growth rate for the last?
We ended up going back the last 30 years. That was
Because
the
you have, from your original numbers there, show that in the previous, the decade,
Mhm.
in the 90s, it was much higher than it has been in
Right.
the last 10 years.
right. So it would be remarkably different if you ran it just for the based on the growth rate of the last decade.
Yes.
So we chose 30 years. So we had a boom year, a slow growth, a boom decade, a slow growth decade, and then something that was sort of in between. And that seemed like a reasonable chunk. And we had 5 or 6 people from the community weighing in on that decision because it did have such an impact.
The growth rate affects how quickly you build out to complete occupancy.
Yeah.
But the model itself, in terms of where things get, where things get located, where things can't be located, what were the inputs to the model other than the population growth that the model is particularly sensitive to?
I can't speak right off the top of my head to exactly what the different weights are for all of these. I know that the growth rate is the primary driver. That's
Frank, the model populates houses right next to the roads first, and then
Right.
off the roads. So does that help answer your question?
Yeah, so it kind of assumes that where there's a road that you first be.
Yes. Yep.
And then okay.
Yeah, and if I had a map that broke it down, you'd see, and if you had all the roads on here, you'd see, yeah. So it populates the roads, which is intuitive, and then there's some randomness to how it fills in at the end, so you can see on that last slide, a lot of these areas, that's where some of the randomness comes in because.
But it's assuming that you keep the same density controls that you have.
Correct.
That's
Right.
probably the biggest factor.
Right.
I would imagine.
That's a big one.
And Sarah, to answer your question, I think the boom decade was 23% growth in Wolfboro, and the model assumes only 2.3 or 2.1% growth.
I think it's 2% annually. So that's an annual rate.
And the 20% was a decade over decade growth.
Yeah.
So you're comparing.
Yeah, annually based on the past 30 years to answer your question. All right, so one of the things we've done for some other communities, this is the Belgrade Lakes area in Maine. I don't know if you're familiar with that area. We did a similar project, and we're looking at lakes in this case, Great Pond and Long Pond. So what this map is showing you is the local community had already delineated these conservation hubs, not all that, somewhat similar to what William and the U.S. Upper Saco Valley Land Trust have done through the NRI process. And then what they're doing is looking at what the buildable land is available within these conservation hubs. So there's still buildable land in these other areas, but they really wanted to focus in and zoom in on these areas. So this is where you sort of overlay the natural resources inventory type information with the development information and see what you get. So today, as we speak, they're really looking at some of their conservation priorities being in these different areas, which have high value habitat, many of the same things we talked
So where
about.
the red go around, those are areas where the town people have decided they want to focus some conservation efforts?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep, in both of these different waters. Again, these are watersheds. These are drainage areas, and they're looking at on a watershed by watershed basis. Interesting in Belgrade that they have a very strong land trust, a very active land trust, which is also a watershed association. So it's hand in hand. There's a few others that do that. So they're really very actively promoting water quality and land conservation at the same time. Okay, so I don't know how detailed you want me to get on this, but I'll go fairly quickly and you can ask me questions. this is an example of what we've often done as that follow-up step. Okay, so you've shown us the build out, that's interesting, so what? What does that mean? And in the case of Lake Wentworth and Crescent Lake, so there are actually two lakes that we were looking at, it was a really big deal. So P stands for phosphorus, and what we do with the separate models, we were able to look at right now, we know what the water quality is in the lake because we have 30 years of data. And then what we were able to calculate is how much phosphorus is flowing in from the land to the lake. And it's a big deal because lakes have very, very little phosphorus. They measured it, you measure phosphorus in lakes and the river in parts per billion. So a tiny, tiny bit can have a huge impact. And that's something as environmental scientists and managers were very concerned about. So we were able to predict that in the 20-year build out that there would be not quite a doubling, but a fairly significant and substantial increase of phosphorus. And then it would more than double under the full build-out. And it was fairly similar for both of these lakes. So again, they're numbers, they're not perfect numbers, but based on the best available science, we feel pretty confident. And then what we were able to do, so these are the concentrations of phosphorus in these two lakes we mentioned. And again, this is 6.4 and 7.4 parts per billion. So think about, and once you get over 15 parts per billion in a lake, this is just sort of a for your information, that's when you start having the algae blooms where the lake can turn green like pea soup. And over my career, I've worked on maybe 35 or 40 of those lakes and have seen them turn green. So I have, firsthand experience when I go to communities and talk about protecting resources. I've seen the worst case scenarios, and a lot of those are heavily in Maine, heavily agricultural watersheds where there was a lot of runoff from the farms that just weren't contained, and the federal government, the Department of Agriculture, spent tens of millions of dollars to clean them up, and the lakes are slowly coming back, and people are slowly moving back to the lakes. China Lake in Maine is a well-known example. So again, we were able. This was the in-lake water quality. We were able to predict that in 20 years the phosphorus levels would increase to 10 and 9, 10 and a half and 9, and then under the full build-out up to 13 and 12.2. So that's in the 43-year time frame. So if our model is accurate and things stay the same, which we know they won't, but still, just as an eye-opener, we know that at this level, unless some changes are made within the community, you're going to start to have some significant problems to the lake, which is the resource for this community. I mean, Winnipesaukee and Lake Wentworth, it's the, I like to call it the industry for, that's why people live there without a doubt. So
a question on that.
Sure.
I'm assuming, having looked at the maps that you showed in the build-out, that there is not so much agricultural land as there might be in the Belgrade Lakes area or other parts. And certainly in Jackson, there's not so much agricultural usage, but we certainly have plenty of homeowners who may use phosphorus in, things like that. And to what extent is that variable if we're using a lot of lawn fertilizers and phosphorus in our laundry and whatever?
Yeah, it does make a difference. Rivers are not as sensitive as lakes, so the Wildcat River, for example, can handle phosphorus much, the water's flowing, it's moving through. You still have to maintain nutrient levels in rivers and lakes, and actually in the next 5 years, you're going to see some nationwide standards that are going to come out on nitrogen and phosphorus levels in rivers. They haven't existed to date. It's been a long process. What I would say for Jackson is what we use for a surrogate for a lot of river and stream projects we work on is impervious cover. So if you're doing a build-out, so that's parking lots and rooftops and roads, and even lawns are considered impervious because water doesn't drain down through. And impervious cover has two major impacts that you can think about here. One is different pollutant levels of all sort, whether it's zinc from our tires, chloride that salt that we use on the roads. As once impervious cover in a watershed gets to 9% or so, all the science that's out there shows that the ecology of that stream or that river goes down at a pretty steep rate once you get higher and higher above that. So just building out impervious cover, this is what percent impervious cover is in this town now. This is what impervious cover would be 50 years from now. And then flooding is the other piece. Again, thinking about the hurricane, impervious cover. I've worked on a lot of streams, especially in Maine. They're much more urbanized than this, but you add a lot of pavement and rooftops, and you have a rain event like this, and the streams are what we call very flashy, and they just rise very quickly. And a lot of that's because of human impacts. So a lot of the stormwater management philosophy has been to not just treat for quality, but treat for quantity as well of the water and the stormwater impacts. So that's what we're doing. And then I always am very careful to present this in public meetings. A lot of our meetings have been a lot of our projects have been for planning boards, or the planning boards have been part of the process, or the town planners, or the selectmen. We remind people that it should be viewed as an estimate only. I think it's dangerous if we say, this is exactly how it's going to be. I mean, you guys have brought up some, very, densities could change, population growth rates, but the models and analysis are only as good as the data that goes into them. And in the work we've done so far, I feel very, it's a strong model based on other things we've worked on. And the growth estimates may change, and then the question about the randomness comes in. So that's an example. Any more questions on kind of what it means? How much does it cost? We generally between about $4,000 and $10,000 per community, and really that it depends on how much sort of upfront labor goes in. How much is digitized already in your town? A town like Conway, which is more complex and much more densely populated, it's going to be more labor intensive as well.
The scenario analysis, for example, let's say we wanted to add another zoning district that had a lower density.
Yep.
Or higher density. Or change zoning districts.
Yep.
You could then rerun the model and show how it's different.
Yeah, we did that for Wolfboro. I don't have it as part of this presentation, but I could add it in. We just finished about 2 weeks ago Center Street, which runs through this area. They're going through rezoning right now, and we did that. We reran the model, and basically, as far as the numbers go, there was a phosphorus increase of 1 or 2 parts per billion in the stream, so it wasn't huge. It was there, but it wasn't tremendous. And we were able to zoom in on that area, which I think was about a 2.5 mile stretch of road.
How much? So that you came back and did that. What did that cost then?
I think it was about $3,000 or so to add that piece on. It would have been more, except we'd already done all the work. And a lot of what we did for that project was a literature search of being able to have a reference for any recommendation that we made in there. So there was a pretty big research component to it as well.
When you talk about the impacts of phosphorus and other water quality metrics on lakes, obviously here we're thinking more about river systems and stopping in general. So, we have to think watershed wide. So, what we're putting in the stream here could impact the water quality down in Saco Biddeford.
Sure.
But I was wondering if there is anything that's tangible, like the pea green soup lake effect, that you could pinpoint to the rivers. For example, growth of invasive algae on the river rocks.
Sure. We did a similar analysis for the upper Salmon Falls headwater lakes, and part of the reason we did that is that the lower Salmon Falls, the estuary, had similar algae blooms. So that's all the way down in Rollinsford and Somersworth. New Hampshire. They were having, and it was coming. They wanted to know, where it was coming from, and that's a long process to figure that out. So that was nutrients again. That was looking at phosphorus as the main contaminant in that case. Actually, phosphorus and nitrogen, I should say, both. But again, yeah, in river systems, impervious cover is a big one. We look at sediment. It's just the impacts of more sedimentations to the rivers as a whole. I won't get into it, but there's a whole part of the science we work in called geomorphology, and when we look at a river or stream, there's chemical, there's biological, and physical. The the chemical is how much oxygen is in the water. What are the nutrient levels? The biological are what's the fish populations and the bugs, and how does that affect the trout populations? And then the physical is what humans do on the land, whether it's doing a clear cut or farm fields or development. How does it actually physically impact the course of the river? And obviously flood events, especially up here in the steep slopes, play into that as well. Development can actually alter the stream courses and how well the streams can push sediment down through the system, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but that actually is a big deal. And you end up having these piles of sediment in the river, and it breaks down the habitat within the streams. But again, I would think impervious cover, if you were looking at Jackson, you wanted to take the next step, would be the most sort of logical. How would this impact our natural resources? Because it is a surrogate. You don't have a lot of lakes, right?
None.
Not zero? None?
You're
Lakes?
Tiny.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, okay.
We have some ponds.
Small ponds.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
But we have quite a few rivers.
Yep. Yeah, and that's the folks in Bartlett were asking a lot about the river and the streams. What are the impacts of the streams and.
Including its water supply.
Right. So.
Oftentimes, what we're seeing as far as the flooding is concerned is a lot of what in the geomorphology of the river concept is that what we need to do to protect our bridges and some of the scenic parts of our river kind of goes against the concept of allowing the natural course of the river to take place as far as pushing sediment downstream.
Right.
What Jackson pretty much has for rivers, none of the sediment ends up here.
Right.
Yet some of the things that we might do to the river might cause sediment to end up in Bartlett or Conway and change things down there. And
True.
If we're being asked to take into consideration that we want to improve the abutments on our bridge so that the bridge stays there during the flood.
Yeah.
Yet some of the things we might do to that might cause sedimentation further down the river a problem.
Right.
It's finding that balance that's.
Yeah, there is, and there are. 20 years ago when our public works directors were placing culverts in the road, we didn't think so much about geomorphology, but you can, if you misalign a culvert, you obviously can impact fish passage, which is a big deal, and then you can cause the river to make big changes right there at that site at a culvert.
So the great downtown, we're concerned about a rock wall that goes along the edge of the Wildcat River.
Yeah.
Right here in the village, and ideally we'd like to maintain that rock wall, but by doing so, are we actually causing other problems that might occur? Because we'd like to keep it the way it looks now, but is that the best practice as far as river management? So it may be the best practice, but there's something that we have to take into consideration when we decide to go ahead and make sure that stone wall stays the same way that it is. That's impacting the way the river's flowing, down towards on the golf course and 11 into Bartlett.
That's a really good question, and again, the Natural Resources Conservation Service had a lot of money that they were spending on putting the stone walls, the riprap along rivers, and I'm thinking of Vermont in particular, where they didn't really think that much about the downstream impacts to that, but the reality, and I remember going to the Mad River in Vermont and looking at a project where they did that. They built a stone wall, and what that did is it deflected all the energy of the river off the stone wall and into the next one, and then into the next one. So it just transferred the energy downstream, and they ended up spending a lot more money kind of fixing things up. And then a big flood came down and blew everything out anyway. So that was the end of that. That was the end of the tax dollars. But yeah, good thoughts. Good questions. So, all right.
So I think if everybody wants to gather around the table, we can go over some specific maps, if those want to.
Yeah.
Do you think that a build-out analysis would be applicable to Jackson?
We've talked about it, the planning board is something that would be part of our master plan process, that we made no decisions, nor do we, it's been deferred till maybe next year for budget reasons.
Do you have any idea how much is digitized within your town as far as any of the
maps.
All the, all the
tax maps are?
tax maps.
Okay.
Yeah.
The tax maps are digitized?
They
Yes.
are.
Yeah, I believe they
I
are.
don't believe they are.
Oh, yes.
Well, they're-
Yeah,
They're not available on your website.
No, they're not digitized, meaning that the data is digitized, not the actual picture. What we have on available digitally is just the image, not the data.
Oh, they're not spatially.
Not the data points.
Okay. So you couldn't pull up the boundary of your property on a GIS map.
I don't believe so.
Okay, and then another question I would have is, I don't know to what extent the maps that Roosevelt already has are fully digitized for Jackson. We also had Whitley Frost do her